It was a July midnight, and from out a full-orbed moon that, like thine own soul soaring, sought a precipitant pathway up through heaven, there fell a silvery silken veil of light, with quietude and sultriness and slumber, upon the upturned faces of 1,000 roses that grew in an enchanted garden. Good morning, Poe fans. We're recording a little bit differently today than we normally do in the evening. And part of the reason is we have extremely special guests, our brother and sister podcast, POEcast, Beyond the Oblong Box with Virginia Poe and Levi Leland. Welcome, guys. We're so glad you're back.
Hi, thank you for having us again.
Yes.
Always a pleasure.
Absolutely. Yes, we have so much fun with you guys.
Yeah, we do.
So we thought for this particular degree, Poe Places, there's several we can choose from, but we like to kind of at first, since we did Ireland last year, we decided to pick up and do Rhode Island this year because not a lot of people know about Poe's connection to Rhode Island, and we just thought that it was just a good year to do this. And so we're going to kind of talk about a little bit of the history first, and then talk about really get down to why did Poe go to Rhode Island for the reasons he did.
Right.
So, Jeanie, do you want to introduce kind of a little bit about the history, or do you want me to start?
Oh, I can do that. That'll be my little contribution this morning. First of all, I want to start out to say that Ireland is an island and Rhode Island is not. Rhode Island is actually a part of the contiguous United States, but it got the name, I don't know how, but it's just kind of weird. Rhode Island, but it's not an island. However, what's really informational for me when I used to teach United States history and the early colonies was how Rhode Island became a colony. And it was founded by a Puritan named Roger Williams, who got ousted from the Puritans in Massachusetts. They were snobs. They didn't like how Roger didn't agree with how they treated the Native Americans. However, Roger was like, I'm not going back to England. You can't make me. And he ran down to Rhode Island. Well, he probably didn't run, but, they at least walked because they didn't have cars.
Walked briskly.
Yeah. and anyway, that Rhode Island started becoming a quote unquote dumping ground for those Puritans that didn't fulfill their puritanical beliefs the way they should and got kicked out. So Roger Williams decided, hey, I'm going to colonize this area for all these rejects or all these people that have differing ideas that actually want to treat people normally and give the Native Americans their due without treating them horribly. But unfortunately, that became the name of Rhode Island first as the sewer. So,
and I think that was coined by Cotton Mather. I think that was who actually said that.
Whoever said it, they definitely did it. Because they stuck them all down there. Every time they kicked them out of the Puritan colony in Massachusetts, they just kicked them down to the sewer in Rhode Island. And then one of the females, I know we're going to be talking about Sarah Whitman, but one of the female, Anne, cannot remember her last name, I believe it was Taylor. But anyway, in history, she was a voice that wanted to speak out in the Puritan belief system because she did not like being cowed and not being able to speak her mind. And so she actually went in front of the Puritan courts. And the Puritan's court says, nope, get out. And so she got kicked out, but she actually ended up in Connecticut. She started in Rhode Island, but then she traveled down to Connecticut. But strong women is what I was going for. Gotcha. Because I know Sarah Whitman, and Levi is probably going to expound upon this a little bit more, but she was very much one of those that had a voice. So, without further ado, take it away, Levi.
Yes.
Well, that was a great, concise history, Jeanie.
Oh.
And I'm happy to be recording live from the sewer. Rhode Island is my home.
And it doesn't stink.
No,
It
it
doesn't
doesn't. It's lovely. It's
nearly as bad. Yeah.
lovely.
Carmen can attest it's not
Yes.
that bad. So Rhode Island, I was born and raised here, and this is kind of a fun episode because not only do I do the podcast with Virginia, but I also kind of made it my life's work, especially in Poe, to highlight his time in Providence, Rhode Island, my home state. After being a pretty dedicated Poe fan for like more than half my life now, I realized within the last like 5 to 6 years that, well, Poe was here. Poe is here right in Rhode Island, where I live and have lived my whole life. And Rhode Island kind of needed a spokesman for Poe's time here. I mean, when you look at Poe's studies today, you have Boston, Massachusetts claiming Poe as their own. He was born there, rightfully so. His mother wrote on that little miniature painting of the Boston Harbor, for my little son Edgar, should ever love Boston, the place of his birth and where his mother found, her most sympathetic friends. And so, Boston has that claim on Poe, and he hated Boston and Boston hated him but today
the feelings were mutual.
Yeah, the feelings were
Yes.
totally mutual.
Yes.
And again, his parents were just kind of passing through Boston for work when he was born there. So other than that, the connections are really loose. But today you have, this big focus on Poe in Boston. And then, of course, you have Poe in Richmond, Virginia, which they have a better, kind of bigger claim, of course.
Well, and there was a time at UVA, and
right. He
so
pretty much grew up
there's
in
a lot
Richmond.
of the family
Yes.
still in Virginia.
Yes.
And he was
saying, I'm gonna
married
sip my tea
in
now.
Richmond. So
Yep.
there's all the things.
Okay. Go
Yeah.
ahead.
Yeah.
I was gonna say something else, but I'm just gonna.
There's a lot of
drinking tea.
And of course, they have the museum to Poe in Richmond, and Boston just erected the statue to Poe within the last decade or so, I think it's been. And and so outside of Richmond, you have Baltimore, Maryland. Of course, they have the biggest claim on Poe. He's buried there. He died there, but he also lived there for a brief time. Is the Poe, his paternal side, the Poes were from Baltimore. Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, they claim Poe today. There's a museum there as well. There's a museum in Baltimore, which were his actual houses, as opposed to Richmond, Virginia, where that museum wasn't his actual residence. He never lived there, but it's the oldest house in Richmond, and they house the most extensive
collection
Yes.
of his personal items and artifacts and photographs but Philadelphia claims his body of works, which is kind of an interesting concept, but he wrote his most prolific works while in Philadelphia. So they kind of say, well, Philadelphia inspired the most, Poe's greatest hits. So, and then of course, I feel like I'm missing. Oh yeah, the Bronx. At that time was Fordham. That saw his final residence, and of course, The Raven was published in New York, which was huge. And Virginia died in Fordham, New York, and today the cottage in which she died in is still up and running, and that's a museum. So, all these geographical places, even South Carolina, Charlestown, they claim they have that little slice of Poe because he was stationed there for a brief time. And, there's some connection to the gold bug there, which they think it might have inspired that story. And, so these little geographical slices of Poe's life are shown in these little states and these cities, and they claim him. And I kind of was realizing, like, well, what happened to Poe in Providence? Poe is here, and it wasn't for a long time, but I can't imagine it was any more or less significant than his time in Boston or his time in South Carolina. Like, why can't we claim Poe? So that's what I made it my mission. I'm like, you know what? This is my new focus, and this is going to be my niche in my Poe fandom. And so I just went to work. Like, I visited the sites. I did so much research. I went to, the Brown University libraries to look at Sarah Helen Whitman's papers and her, personal effects to really get a sense of, what's the history here? You know, what happened, you know? And I kind of discovered that Providence has quite the story to tell when it comes to Poe, 100%. And so that's when I made the website, edgarallanpoe.com. I kind of use that as like my dumping grounds, you know, of all the research I was doing. I just wanted somewhere to put it all, you know? And so
it's your personal sewer per se.
It's my I was just gonna say it's my personal dump. It's the sewer of Poe in Providence.
Oh,
that's very apropos.
It's very apropos.
There it is.
There we go.
It's
we have truly begun.
Yeah.
Yes.
It's been a passion project for sure. And then within the last like 3 years, well, I debuted my tour, my walking tour, which is kind of like that was the accumulation of everything, was the walking tour. And Carmen has been on it.
It is amazing.
She loved it.
Yes, amazing. And we even had Brown University's graduation.
Yep.
We were able to, you know, go around all of that, still got to go to all the locations.
Yep.
And it was a beautiful day. It was a hot day, but beautiful day. And if you are ever in Providence, you need to take Levi's tour. You will learn so much. I
appreciate that.
You will learn so much. It was so much fun.
Awesome. Yeah, I did have a lot of fun on that one. And it's always fun to share it with somebody that really has a passion for Poe and understands like how important some of these parts of his life really were, and they can see that. And so, you know, through this endeavor, I've also kind of highlighted a rather underrated character, in my opinion, in Poe's biography.
Yes.
Sarah Helen Whitman, of course. You know, she's flown under the radar, in my opinion, for pretty much all of Poe studies. I mean, a few people have really highlighted her in some papers and some works, but when you read the general Poe biography, it really just kind of, she's a footnote, you know, but her work in Poe's life and his legacy was insane. I mean, if it wasn't for her, we probably wouldn't know nearly as much as we know about Poe during that time of his life.
Absolutely. And a lot happened during that time.
A lot happened.
A ton, you know, and he shared with her things about his childhood and some of the things that about his marriage to Virginia and things that I don't think he really shared with anybody else. And she, instead of, you know, being kind of bitter after the relationship and just kind of being done with it and wiping her hands of it, like some of the other Poe women did, she decided, no, I'm actually going to use this information and I'm going to publish it. I'm going to write about it. I'm going to make sure that people know the real Poe, you know, and she staunchly defended his reputation after Griswold totally smeared him, you know, and it wasn't convenient for her to do so either. That's the other thing too. It's not like, you know, she was a poetess, she was an essayist, she was a critic, a literary critic. And so, you know, her reputation kind of depended on what she published and what she wrote, and the overall consensus on Poe at that time, especially after his death and even his later life, was you know, rumors, scandal, you know, his drinking, all these really negative things. So it wasn't totally convenient for her to stand up and come to his defense, but she did it, and to her dying day. And so we kind of owe her so much in that sense. So that's kind of like the teaser. That's how I advertise it. But of course the story starts from beginning to end. There's it's crazy. It's insane.
It totally is. And she was just a phenomenal lady and so intelligent. And it's almost like she and Poe were like almost the female male of each other, you know, the very similar, just when you and I talked about that on the tour. What'd you say, Virginia?
I said there's reasons for that.
Yes, exactly. And
a very big reason.
Yes, and I think Virginia, you're drinking a tea today.
I am. I'm not spilling it. I'm drinking it. Well, I guess we are kind of spilling the tea.
Yeah, kind of.
Oh, I think there'll be some tea spilled on this episode for sure.
Yes.
Well, it's going to the right spot. We're talking about the sewer.
Thank you, Jeanie.
Well, Jeanie Smith, ladies and gentlemen, she'll be here all week.
Yes, exactly.
Oh my goodness.
No, actually, in honor of Miss Sarah, who I admire greatly because I myself, she was very well known for her gardens, and I love gardening, which most people don't really know about me, but I am, and I'm a big rose girl. I've always been a rose girl. My dad grew roses and I love roses, and I have 3 beautiful bushes that I really hope Mother Nature hasn't killed with our recent 20-degree weathers. Cross my fingers.
Yes, let's keep your fingers crossed.
Fingers crossed. But I am drinking some very lovely St. Valentine tea from my beloved Jolie Tea Company just up the way in Salem, Mass. It's not an advertisement for them, by the way. It's just fabulous freaking tea, man. I'm telling you. And it's black rose tea. And I thought that would be appropriate to drink while we talk about Miss Whitman. So, Levi, please tell the story. Can you tell us the story again about how Eddie first
Levi's story time. Levi's story time.
So
I do love this story.
It is. It's so beautiful. It's beyond beautiful. Yeah, it's amazing.
Yeah, the romance between Poe and Whitman was unlike any other, I think, in his life, because it's like a movie. Everything that happened was just like, you couldn't have written a better romance tale, you know, and but except it was real life. It was actually happening. So in 1845, it was July, a hot summer evening in 1845, Poe first visits Providence in his lifetime. And now he had just published The Raven earlier that year in January, so he was becoming well known. He was really making a name for himself, and you know, his mark on literature was pretty much solidified at that point because The Raven was so famous. And he began a friendship with Frances Osgood, which was another literary lady in his life, and there's a whole, you know, story that goes with that for a whole other podcast. But
yes.
Frances Osgood invites Poe to Providence. She's lecturing before the Franklin Lyceum Club at Howard's Hall, and so she invites Poe to come see her, you know, hear her lecture. So he gets on the first train from New York. He comes down to Providence and attends the lecture. And so afterwards, the two decided to take a walk along Providence, and you know, especially the east side. And so walking arm in arm, it was about midnight. And again, it was hot, it was sultry, it was just a very, very warm, humid night. And so they find themselves on Benefit Street, and they're traveling north. And as they approach what's now Church Street, the little hill that goes down right on the side of Whitman's house, Poe stops in his tracks. He glances down into the backyard of Whitman's home, which was right there on Benefit Street. And he sees this woman. She's clad all in white. So Whitman wore all black in the wintertime, and she wore all white in the summertime. That was her attire. So it was summer, it was hot. She was wearing all white, shawls, a veil, a muslin dress, and there was a full moon out, and the moonlight was illuminating these garments in the pitch black, of course, and they're kind of floating in the warm, humid breeze, and Poe is just taken back. You know, it's like he's seeing the most beautiful ghost he's ever seen, like a woman from his own tale, you know, from one of his own tales. So she's tending her rose garden in the middle of the night, which she often did, and which a lot of people often did. Virginia might be able to attest, being a gardener herself, that on a hot night like that, you'd want to keep the plants hydrated throughout the night. So she was doing that. You know, some people ask me, like, why was she out in the middle of the night watering her roses? You know, why was she sleeping? Well, no, that's what she was doing. So
save time to do it.
Yeah. Frances Osgood, of course, notices Poe looking at Sarah Helen Whitman, and because Frances Osgood knew Sarah Helen Whitman, she offered to introduce them right on the spot. But Poe adamantly declined an introduction right then and there. He almost so aggressively that it started a little quarrel between him and Francis Osgood. You know, it was like, no, 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 I don't want to be introduced. Like, let's just keep going. So that's what they did. They continued on their walk. But Sarah Helen Whitman would leave a perpetual mark on Poe's mind 100% over the next 3 years when they would finally begin their romance. It's important to remember that in 1845, and when Poe first saw Whitman, he was still married to his wife, Virginia. And when Francis Osgood had introduced, or not introduced, but mentioned Whitman's name to Poe, she addressed her as Mrs. Whitman. So Poe had also thought that she was married, and this could be why he was so adamant about not being introduced. He didn't want to get tangled up in some kind of, you know, into a married woman, you know. And what he didn't know was she was in fact widowed. So, you know, she was widowed in 1833, quite a while prior to that. And she just had kept, of course, as widows did, they kept their last name and still address themselves as Mrs. So that could be why he was kind of, you know, shy at that night. And 3 years later, of course, was when, now at this point, you know, Virginia had passed away in 1847. So Poe was kind of on this desperate hunt for a female companion, as we know, and a lot of Poe fans know that those years after Virginia's death, he was just chasing women, you know, any female figure that was giving him any kind of attention, not even necessarily romantic attention, just tender, caring kind of attention. He was just, you know, captivated. He needed that type of affection in his life. And so Sarah Helen Whitman was asked to submit a poem to a Valentine party, and one of Anne Lynch's Valentine parties. And so she submitted a poem to Poe, a Valentine. And everybody discouraged her. Anne Lynch, other members of the literati were like, no, don't write one to Poe. He's not invited, because at this time he was shunned, as we know. It was just those it's crazy. I feel like it was like the first time Poe came to Providence, he was at the prime of his life and the height of his career. And then by the second time he came to Providence, he was just an outcast and everything just kind of fell apart for him, which is so sad. But it still didn't stop Whitman. You know, she was like, being the very strong, independent woman that she was, that, you know, she was like, no, I'm writing a poem to Poe. I admire his work. I admire his genius. I'm submitting this poem to Poe. So she submitted the poem to the Valentine party, but they didn't read it. They didn't read it because Poe wasn't, not only was Poe not invited, but they also figured it would be in everybody's best interest to not even acknowledge him at this party and any poems that, you know, were addressed to him. So that's why Sarah Helen Whitman had then published the poem herself in the home journal to get it out there, to say, I wrote this tribute to Poe and he deserves to see it. And so that's what she did.
That is so cool. And one note I remember from the tour that it just really resonated with me, kind of going back to the story of the rose garden. There are roses still growing there.
There are roses still in that very spot. I like to think, and it's kind of, you know, local lore, that they are the descendants of the very roses that she gardened herself. You know, roses always come back wherever they're planted. So, you know, that's what I like to think, and that's what I like to believe. It's possible that more could have been planted, or, you know, some of them aren't the originals, but I think some are. I think some of them did end up coming back. So
I agree with you. Yes.
Yeah. When you walk by that very spot, you can take the same walk that Poe took that night, and you can look down and you can still see a rose garden in full bloom in July. And it's quite a sight. It's really, you're living in that history, and you're living in history in that very moment, you know?
Yeah. And I think, Levi, you have never gotten to go in the house, right?
No. So that house, unfortunately, at the time that Whitman lived there, it was, a two-family house. But at that time, two families weren't like two separate apartments. It was an open floor plan, but each family had their own living quarters on their respective ends of the house. But around 1950, they were divided up into 5 apartment units. So the house is still there. It's said that some of the interior is still original, like the woodwork and some marble fireplaces that are still in there that were original. Yeah. But unfortunately, I've never been able to go in there. It's actually owned by the Episcopal Church, which St. John's, which is located right down the hill. So if you have Whitman's house, then you have the Rose Garden in the back, and then further back you have St. John's Church and the adjoining churchyard, which they frequented, and Sarah Helen Whitman frequented that graveyard during her time in the house.
Well, and that's what I was going to ask next is tell us about kind of after her poem was published, what happened after that?
Yeah. So
with them.
Poe, of course, sees this tribute, and Poe being Poe was like, all right, I got her I got her in the bag. So, he remembers Sarah Helen Whitman in Providence, and that's the same woman he saw in the Rose Garden that Frances Osgood had mentioned to him, and so he's just taken back by this unsolicited attention, because it's not like he was trying to get her attention at this time. She just happened to publish this tribute to him, and mind you, she didn't know that he had saw her 3 years prior walking by her house. She had no idea. So this was just all very coincidental. And so in response, he goes to one of his published editions of his poetry, and he tears out the poem To Helen. But of course, that was to Helen Stannard, the mother of his childhood friend. So it was just very convenient that they it bore her nickname, because a lot of Whitman's friends called her Helen, and then Poe would call her Helen throughout their romance. So this was very convenient for him. He didn't have to write a new poem, so he tore it out. He sent it to her anonymously. He didn't sign it or anything. And so she received the poem, and that was about it. She was probably, she probably appreciated the sentiment. She probably knew that it was from Poe, but because there wasn't anything concrete, she just kind of disregarded it after reading it and said, okay, that was nice. And now Poe is wondering, like, oh man, now, after a while, no response back. So he's like, all right. He decides, I should probably write her a poem tailored just for her. I should probably make it so that she knows that I actually know her existence. I can, use things in the poem to really solidify the fact that I know her personally, and I can kind of tell the story. So he writes his second titled poem To Helen, and in this poem, he would recount his first sighting of her in that rose garden. And so those roses are kind of immortalized now by at least one of Poe's poems, which is really cool. So he writes the poem and he sends that one to her, but he doesn't sign it. And at the time, he didn't even write a title. He didn't have a title for it. He just sent it as it was. So now Whitman receives this, and she's like, okay, this is Poe. In fact, one of her friends that were visiting her house that day when she received it recognized the handwriting and was like, oh, that's Mr. Poe, totally. And so now Whitman, being kind of reserved as she was, especially with romance, she didn't reply again. She was probably just trying to keep the waters still, Yeah. But we have to remember she kind of started it. So, but I don't think she expected such a response back. So she disregards this poem again. She doesn't reply to it. And again, she doesn't really know who it's from either. So it's not like she can write directly back to the sender, even though she kind of knows it's Poe. But she didn't publish anything. I think Poe probably expected her maybe to publish something again in a magazine or a newspaper, in response, which the poets often did at that time. You know, they would exchange poems to one another, but just kind of publish them, sometimes anonymously, and you would, you know, discover it that way. It's not like everything was direct mail to one another. So
yeah, that's really kind of a cool thing.
When you think about it, you know, you could just kind of leave it a little bit ambiguous, but so that you know, writers still kind of knew like, oh, I know that style, I know that's to me, and they could respond back. So it was an interesting kind of method, but that's how they did it. But Whitman didn't publish anything. She didn't make any. She didn't, you know, she didn't put any attention towards these poems that Poe was sending. So, finally, Poe decides, all right, well, let me see if I could at least visit her. I'll call on her. If she's not going to reply back, I'll just go see her. But he was unsure if she was still in Providence because number one, she wasn't responding to his letters that he was sending to Providence, not to her address exactly. And because he wasn't getting a response, he wasn't quite sure, you know, is she even getting the letters? You know, is she still in Providence? It's been 3 years, you know. So he writes to her, posing as an autograph collector under the pseudonym Edward S.T. Gray. So this was a kind of a cutesy thing, but at this point, it was pretty much known that Poe was the one writing to her, and so it was more of a cutesy thing than anything else. But he poses as an autograph collector, sends her a letter requesting her autograph. So she signs it, she signs her name, and then sends it back. And so this was Poe's way of just, you know, ensuring that she was in fact still in Providence before he bought train tickets to come down, you know, and spent money on travel. So it was on September of 1848. So it was February is when the exchange started, and then finally in September of that same year, Poe comes to Providence for the second time in his life, and he calls on her at her house on Benefit Street, and so the two would meet. And the first meeting, it went quite well. You know, they, like Carmen, you had said earlier, they were very like-minded. You know, they were both literary critics. In fact, Whitman was considered one of the first female literary critics in the country next to Margaret Fuller. So, you know, she had quite a stance in literature. She had a presence. And so they were both literary critics. They were both poets. And they were both academics. You know, they had all sorts of ideas when it came to art and literature and religion and all those things that were current at the time, and politics. And so, you know, they strolled St. John's Churchyard, which is a stop on my tour. And you can kind of get a sense of how that first date went. And Poe gives her 2 editions of his works, which he inscribes to her on the flyleaves of each page. And so he kind of does pretty good, you know, except he proposes marriage, which, come on, like...
That was pretty quick.
Yeah. First date, I don't know. And you know, my patrons usually get a kick out of that. Because it's like, Poe, what are you doing? You know? Whitman was at the time 45 and Poe was 39. So she was about 6 years older than him. And I mean, that's not really, I mean, especially in today's standard, that's nothing. And that's not, and 45 isn't even old. But back then it was kind of like, you know, Whitman's like, I'm a much older woman, you know, my health is very frail, and I can't be involved in a romance with you, but we can definitely be, you know, friends, and we can kind of have a friendship, and we can share our literary ideas. You know, we have that those common interests, and we can be like colleagues and friends, whatever. So Poe,
and they had the same birthday too.
And they shared the birthday. Yes, so they were both,
which is
born on,
really cool.
Yeah, it is really cool. And I always thought like, oh yeah, I wonder what you know, what a birthday party would have looked like since they shared a birthday. They would have probably had a huge bash. But then we did the whole Poe birthday episode, and we kind of discovered people didn't really celebrate their birthdays.
And then I crushed your soul.
Yeah,
I know it did.
It was kind of like not even a thing. So they probably didn't even really like care. Like she never really made any kind of special note like we shared a birthday. She just kind of wasn't even that big of a deal. So
yeah,
yeah. So that kind of ruined that for me. I'm like, dang it,
that would have been really cool to,
that's right.
yeah.
But today we can celebrate them both on that day, which is pretty cool.
Yes.
So
Yes.
so that first date went well. Whitman, of course, rejects Poe's proposals of marriage, but he continues. So he would visit Providence intermittently over the next 3 months from, September to December, and the romance would just take off. He was very persistent, as we know from other romances he had, and he didn't let up. He didn't very easily take no for an answer, so he would be very persistent, and the romance just took off from there. Whether Whitman liked it or not, she was pretty much tangled up with Poe.
Yeah, absolutely. And Jeanie, for her cover picture on Zoom today, has a picture that we definitely want Levi to talk about, because I know you did some digital editing to that photo, and so and that ties to kind of toward the end of their relationship.
Yeah, so that's kind of like the stock photo I made for my website and for everything. It shows Poe and
It's
Whitman,
nice.
and thank you. I like the kind of I like the way Whitman's kind of looking at Poe from the side, and because that was kind of like the dynamic. She was just kind of very watchful over him and what he was doing, and very careful. She very lightly dealt with him. She had to, and so that particular photo of Whitman was taken about 4 years after the romance, 4 or 5 years. So she was closer to her 50s at that point. And that particular photo of Poe, which we know it today as the Whitman daguerreotype, that was actually taken right here in Providence. So it was taken in Providence, and 4 days before that, the Ultima Thule daguerreotype of Poe was taken in Providence, which would have been the first photo of Poe taken in Providence, and it's his most iconic. So this is one thing I like to highlight on my tour, and of course in this whole endeavor, is that Providence took two of the most iconic images of Poe that we know, and he only sat 6 times before that we know of. More photographs might surface one day, but we know that he sat 6 times throughout his life to have an actual photograph, a daguerreotype, taken. And so 1/3 of those sittings took place here in Providence. And so I'll start with the Ultima Thule since it came first, but we might be able to post a picture of it, but I'm sure people know it's the most iconic. It's Poe, like full face view. Half his face is kind of sagging to the side a little bit. Very, very heavy shadows. That was taken at the studio of Samuel Masery in Hartshorn on November 9th, 1848. So just a few weeks after Poe first met Sarah Helen Whitman, at her house for the first time. And it was taken 4 days after he attempted suicide. So, people see the photograph and they kind of, they relish in it because, oh, that's Poe. He's dark and scary, and he wrote all those horror poems and stories, and that's perfect. That's what we think he'd look like. But that's not really what he looked like. He was pretty refined. He was pretty put together most of the time, but he was quite ill. He was sick in that photo, and it's sad today to know the context behind it and to think that it's so iconic for being such a bad photo of him, and people like to associate that kind of dark and sickly look with someone who writes horror.
And I went ahead and shared it.
There we go.
Thank you, Carmen. That's perfect.
Yeah, so from your website.
Yeah, perfect. Another plug. I love it. Thank you.
Yes.
So that's it. And so he had attempted suicide. He had acquired 2 ounces of laudanum, and he acquired that here in Providence. And so I have my speculations as to who provided him with that drug.
Interesting.
Yeah, there was a fellow here. He was one of Whitman's friends, but his name was William Jewett Pabody. And anyone who visits my website can look at the menu above and go to people, click on him and read about him. He's a shady guy, and I think he had a lot to do with Poe's destruction here in Providence, 100%. And so Poe takes 1 ounce of this drug, which is a tincture of opiates and alcohol. And we know that, number one, alcohol already had terrible effects on Poe. So, already a bad idea. But then add the opium on top of it.
Yeah.
Poe is totally intolerant to drugs. And this was the only time that we know of and that he more than likely took drugs. There was no other time Poe recreationally used drugs. He did it this one time in a suicide attempt, and then of course Griswold perpetuated the whole myth that Poe is some drug-addled, madman.
And
But
I wish we could erase that. I'm not into banning books, but
I know, right? But
that
can we ban that?
We can ban that one.
Yeah, it's pure libel. It's pure libel.
Yeah, it's terrible. And again, this is why Whitman did what she did. She stood up after Poe's death, and she totally refuted these things and stood against Griswold to say, no, you're 100% wrong.
Yeah.
So Poe takes 1 ounce of the drug. He goes to Boston, and he plans to take the other ounce to end his life ultimately. But that first ounce made him so ill that he got sick. It said that he had vomited up that first dose, so it didn't sit with him, and then he was so ill that he couldn't take the second dose, which in a way, thankfully, because it probably would have had very devastating effects on him if not killed him. So he ended up sleeping off this whole thing. He came back to Providence, and 3 days later engages in a night of drinking with a man that he met at a hotel, the Earl House that he was staying at in Providence. That was actually a stone's throw from Whitman's house. A man named Mr. McFarland. He had recognized Poe as the great poet, the author, the writer of the Raven, and he, I think, kind of enabled Poe to drink a little bit. He probably bought him a drink. He was like, hey, let me buy you a drink and let's chat. And he was a fan, and so probably not knowing what alcohol did to Poe, kind of got him to start drinking, unfortunately. And so Poe, as we know, started drinking and quickly became quite inebriated. And so, but this McFarland guy looked after him throughout the whole night. And so the next morning, convinced Poe to go have his photo taken at the studio on Westminster Street. And so that's what produced the Ultima Thule photograph. So again, 4 days after that suicide attempt, the day after a night of heavy drinking. I mean, that's why Poe looks the way he does. He's not well in the photo.
Yeah.
And it's sad. It's his most infamous photo for that reason, but a lot of people don't know the context behind it. It's very sad that that point in Poe's life, he thought that ending his life would have been his best option. And so he was just very depressed. He was very hopeless at this time. And Whitman, he believed Whitman was the one that would save him from all this doom. And in fact, right after he sat for that photograph, he walked to Whitman's house and he called on her, and her mother answered the door and, was kind of like, all right, sit here. And it took Whitman 2 hours before she could nerve herself to see him. When she finally did, he threw himself at her feet. He grabbed her dress and he begged her to save him from some terrible impending doom. And she said his voice was so appalling that it rang through the house. And she said that he clung to her so tightly that when she kind of went to step back, he tore the dress. He was just not doing well. So her mother had her go prepare a cup of really strong coffee for Poe. She thought that would kind of help with his mania. And so she did. And then she called a physician, Dr. Oki, to come to the house and have a look at Poe. And so the doctor, checked Poe over. He said, the best thing you can do is stay with a friend. Don't go back to the hotel because you might do something foolish. Stay with a friend. Have someone keep an eye on you. So William Pabody, the guy that I suspect supplied Poe with the drugs, took Poe into his home. So I don't know how well of an idea how good of an idea that was, but that's what happened. Pabody looked over Poe over the next few days. And he recovered. He recovered from this because 4 days after that photograph was taken and all that stuff happened, he sat for the Whitman daguerreotype, which we see in Jeannie's picture. And this shows a much more refined, kind of put together, healthier looking Poe. In fact, this was his favorite image of himself. He said this was the best and most authentic likeness of himself that he had ever sat for. So, and it's my favorite picture of him. I actually have it tattooed on my arm. He's shown with his frock coat from West Point, the coat that he kept from his whole time in from my cat's distracting me at the door, meowing. I don't know if you can hear that, but
that clan.
I think it's the new kitty, Greenwood.
Oh, Greenwood. Okay.
Yeah, and he's a little bit of a menace. That's why he's not allowed in the room right now. He'd be chewing wires and everything. But so he sits for that photograph, and it's thought to be an engagement gift to Sarah Helen Whitman because at some point between the Ultima Thule photograph and this photograph, she had finally agreed to marry him. So he had sat for this photo. It's the only one that he actually commissioned himself and paid for himself. All his other photographs were taken by other people who convinced him to go have it taken, and someone else had paid for it. This one he paid for. He sat for on his own merit. It was on his own accord. And he said it was the best likeness of him ever taken. So Providence captured Poe at his absolute worst and his absolute best, which I think is pretty interesting and pretty iconic in itself because, I mean, what none of the other Poe cities can say, oh, well, we took this icon. Poe did sit for other photographs, but none so iconic as these two. So that's another little
so close together.
And so close together. Yeah. I don't think in any of Poe's photographs do we have ones that were taken just days apart. All the other daguerreotypes were taken within years.
Right.
And there are some, I know, when he sat for the Thompson and he sat for the Annie, 2 different plates were made. So that one sitting produced 2 different images, but they're only slightly different. The pose was only a little bit changed. So I don't know, that doesn't really count. To me, this shows 2 very different sides of Poe over, just a few days. So Whitman agrees to marry Poe finally, and it was, within a month, I think, is a fair amount of time that from when they first started their whole thing to when she finally agreed to marry him, because he, of course, was persistent. And there were conditions, though. There were conditions set to that marriage, of course, the engagement. One was that, he stopped drinking. And the other was that she get her mother, who hated Poe, who said she'd rather see her daughter dead than married to Poe. She wanted her mother to consent to the union. So Poe, Whitman, they were both happy with these. Poe vowed sobriety. And so they planned to wed sometime in December, but they hadn't set a date just yet.
Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, there's another place in Rhode Island that it's probably it might be my favorite place that I visited actually before I knew you or anything. The first time my husband and I went to Rhode Island in Providence, and that's the Athenaeum. And so do you want to talk a little bit about that? It is such a neat place. I felt like Poe and Sarah Helen Whitman were around me going in there. It's so cool.
Yeah, you really do feel their presence. It's incredible. The Athenaeum is the 4th oldest library in the country. It was established in 1836. It was they operated as a member-funded library that was open to the public, and they still run under that same model. So anybody is free to visit the library, go inside, look at the books, look at the art. But you have to be a member to be able to check a book out.
Okay.
And so those memberships are what essentially fund the library to keep it open. But this library served as kind of a little hideaway for Poe and Whitman during their courtship. And when you go inside and you look, you can see why. I mean, you think two Victorian authors, poets, where would be a nice place for them to have a romance? Look at the Athenaeum. It's beautiful. It's and so they spent a lot of time there. And so the Athenaeum has a number of tangible artifacts that relate to Poe and Whitman, but also they have some oral history that is quite interesting when it comes to Poe and Whitman in the library. So one story that's really fun, that is a good example of both, is that Whitman and Poe were at the Athenaeum one morning, and Whitman had read Ulalume, and as we know, that was one of Poe's poems, but he had published it in the American Whig Review anonymously. So she was infatuated with this poem. She loved it. She loved the language, the mood. This was just right up her alley. And so she had asked all her friends, everybody she knew, have you read the poem? Do you know who the author is? And everyone just kind of shook their head. No one knew. It was anonymous. I'm sure people had their guesses, and I'm sure a lot of them did guess Poe, but still, they were unsure. So while Poe and Whitman were in the library that morning, she had asked him, Edgar, do you know that poem Ulalume in the American Review? Have you read it? What are your thoughts? Without saying a word, Poe very humbly turns in the alcove where they were sitting to the shelf. He pulls the volume, the American Review, off the shelf. He opens up to the poem, and with a pencil, signs his name at the bottom, defacing one of their library books. But this was his very romantic and, as I said, humble way of just letting Sarah Helen Whitman know that I'm the author.
Yes.
So, it's just like such a Poe thing to do. And so the Athenaeum, of course, today are very, very, very happy that he did deface one of their library books.
Yes. Oh my gosh.
It's one of their most treasured artifacts, excuse me.
Yeah.
In fact, that very volume, it stayed on the shelf for 20 years. So 20 years after the romance, Whitman was corresponding with John Henry Ingram, one of Poe's early biographers, real biographers. And she recalls this happening. So she's like, and she had kind of forgotten about it, but the conversation about her romance with Poe prompted her to remember this little anecdote. So she went to the library, which is right next to her house. All these stops are within a mile in each other, which makes for a perfect walking tour.
Yes, it does. Just you got the hills. You got the hills.
Plug. It makes a great walking tour. No.
Yes, it does.
So she goes back to the library. She finds the volume, opens up to the poem, and sure enough, lightly etched in pencil, his signature is still there. So she's like, oh, this is perfect. So she gives it to the librarians. And, of course, at that point, by the 1870s, Poe's fame was pretty much solidified at that point. And his, he was a well-known internationally and worldwide. I mean, he was well known. So the Athenaeum were like, oh, wow, they were so thrilled to have this. And so since that day, they have kept it in their special collection. So you can view it by appointment, or, sometimes they do display it in their exhibit room.
Yeah.
And I just think it's so amazing that not only the artifact and the story, but also the fact that Sarah Helen Whitman herself was the one that went back to the library, pulled it off the shelf to find it, and saw that it was there. And from her hands to the librarians, they have kept it in their special collection. So it's just another role that Whitman played in Poe's overall legacy, and how we remember him, and how we can celebrate him today and see these things. And it's just amazing. So I love telling that story. But if you're ever,
I love that one. Yeah.
It's a good one. It's like one of their favorite ones too. And so of course the Athenaeum is always a great place to visit if you're around. And of course, if you come on the tour, we visit. And in 2019, if you ever have seen pictures of the Athenaeum or have been there, they have like a pantheon of busts of all famous faces. They have Byron, they have Franklin and Washington and Dante. They have all, the most notable thinkers and people of the time, but they never had Edgar Allan Poe, and he was their most famous visitor. So in 2019, I had conspired with them, since I own a copy of Quinn's bust, life-size bust of Poe, to have another copy made, and they have it now displayed above their entryway so that they could also include Poe within, their pantheon of famous faces and thinkers. So now when you enter and exit the library, Poe is right above you looking down, and
that's
you can
amazing.
remember his time in the city. And that was one thing I was very happy to contribute to help bring Poe's legacy kind of back to Providence.
Absolutely. And I know, kind of going back to Ullalum, I know Virginia, that's one of her absolute favorites.
Yeah, it's a good one.
Yeah, it's a beautiful one, and it's really funny. When Levi and I started our journey in the podcast together, admittedly, Sarah was someone from that realm that I didn't know a whole lot about, but I knew he was going to be a great
I'll tell you about her.
Great teacher. I was like, all right, tell me about your girl. Girl, because I don't know nothing about her. And I mean, I knew she was a poet, and I knew there was a period of time where he had spent time with her and he had been there, but beyond that, I really didn't know the nooks and crannies, so to speak, in the same way that Levi does. And I was just so taken aback. And so when I learned that she was obsessed with Ullalum, I'm like, I know I have a lot in common with my namesake, but I feel a big connection to this woman too, because I mean, I'm in my garden at night.
Yep.
I like to wear all white during the summer, and I'm in all black the rest of the time. And I love to wear headscarves. What's going on here? I was like, okay, so I've got this other connect, and it's funny how there's things that have been discussed here that in the next month or so, it's all going to tie together. But it's amazing how large everything is, but how small everything is at the same time, and how there's all this connection. And
absolutely.
So, and honestly, truly, if it were not for her, we probably wouldn't have a lot, because especially during the early 1800s, there wasn't a whole lot of record keeping in the same way that we saw it towards the latter half of the 1800s. And so because of her, and letters and correspondences, because we know that Eddie didn't keep a diary or anything like that, we have chunks here and there, or letters from Mariah that talk about what's going on with the kids. So we have that, but we don't but Sarah really
she kept great records.
Great records.
I've been through all of them at the John Hay. I mean, that's what's another amazing part of what I've been able to do is personally handle and read through and flip through her notes and her letters and her manuscripts and compile this history firsthand from the woman who lived it. And she kept everything. She kept scraps. She made scrap books. One thing I always find clever about Whitman is that she would color code her notes so that certain things are in blue or red crayon, and that she would circle and make little annotations. And they meant different things. It's like she was so in her head.
Yeah.
It was just amazing. And so she just kept this amazing record of everything and anything Poe, and she gave these resources to everybody who inquired. That was the other thing too. She didn't hoard all the information, and she didn't, not talk to people like some of the other Poe women did. Like Marie Louise Shue didn't really say much after her time with Poe, and even Elmira Roycer didn't. She kept very quiet.
Yes.
So and Annie Richmond. a little more so. She was a little bit more vocal about her romance with Poe, or romance. I say romance, friendship, but it was a romance. But it's always complicated. But Sarah Helen Whitman was like the only one that was actually using materials and her resources to spread the information about Poe and the accurate information about Poe. And biographers were appealing to her for her aid in helping them compile their biographies, and so she was giving them materials and articles and things published about Poe, and she would also stay up to date with all the current publications and articles about Poe, and say, and she was able to decipher and tell biographers, hey, this article totally wrong, like that the author got it wrong, like that's not right, but this one, yes, this is totally great, use this one. She would help sift through the information to really bring the most accurate accounts of Poe's life and times and his works to light. So without her doing all that, I don't know, I think a lot of that misinformation would have slipped through the cracks. Because not many other people in Poe's life were actually doing that to that extent. Even Maria Clem, I mean, she was writing to people and staying, in correspondence with people, but she wasn't publishing things. She wasn't, criticizing articles and things, publicly to say this is right, this is wrong. She wasn't an academic like Whitman was. So Whitman gave us that first, like, she was like the first Poe scholar, in a way. In a lot of ways. And so without her work and that foundation that she made, who knows where we'd be today. We'd probably be a lot farther behind than we are.
I agree.
Her,
It'd be even more mystery.
And it's one of those things that it just, not that the other women in his life, his romances, that they didn't love him or care for him, that way, but it just shows that even though her romance with Poe didn't work out, he didn't live up to, being in the temperance, part of the guidelines she set, that he fell that one time, she still respected him, the man, the poet, the writer, and wanted his legacy to live on because she knew how great he was. And it just kind of shows that the depth of how much she probably really cared for him.
Exactly. And that's really well said.
Well, and correct me if I'm wrong, Levi, and this is just something that I've been meaning to talk to you about, because it's something I've been thinking a lot about, because of some personal things. But knowing that she had been widowed and had been widowed for so long, and knowing that, he was recently a widower, there's a lot, grief does weird things to people, and it affects everybody a little bit differently. And for some folks, they get through it faster. And for others, it takes years.
Or never goes away. Or never goes away.
And then you have moments where, you have a pretty good stretch of time where you're like, I'm okay. And other days, it hits you hard. But I feel that she probably, and this is, of course, this is just me going, I wonder if part of their connection is she understood what he was going through. She understood that loss, and probably didn't look at him as some crazy man. Like she knew what was happening with him. And so I feel like some of that caring came from that.
I think
that
that's
was not that long after.
Virginia, that's a very valid point.
And I never really considered that, but I think you're totally right. I think she certainly empathized with Poe's suffering at that time, and instead of just kind of brushing him off and kind of shooing him away because he was so frantic, she was trying to understand his grief and help him through it, even if it meant that she would have to kind of be almost part of his heartache in a way, because but she knew what was going to be best for him and for her. And I think she was just more or less trying to be that kind of watchful friend, that person to be like, hey, I'll be with you through this, and I'll give you the hard answers, but I'll also give you the soft answers too, and I'll kind of nurture you and care for you through this, because she was widowed very young. She was only 30, and she was widowed, and she never remarried, and she had a few suitors even before Poe, and after, men that wanted her hand, but she was like, no. I don't know if she ever really intended to get married again, her first marriage, to John Winslow Whitman, he was just a very impractical man. And so, he went to prison for a brief time during their marriage because he signed a bad check. He set his dean's haystacks on fire at Brown University as like a college prank, and almost got arrested for that, but fled Providence before he could. Like, he was just this crazy kind of impractical dude, but she was young, and she was still finding her way. And I think his kind of unexpected and tragic death kind of put it into perspective for her. Like, okay, I kind of had my run, and now I really have to make sure if I'm to get married again, I choose the right one, and then here you have Poe comes along, and he's just so adamant, I don't, if Poe wasn't as tenacious as he was to win her hand, it would have been over and done with fairly soon. She would have kept a correspondence, but she wouldn't have entertained it for as long as she was, and even agreed to a marriage on certain conditions if he wasn't just so persistent. So I think there's such a accumulation of things that I think was kind of going into both of their mindsets in this whole romance. And but my thinking is, I think she probably did really empathize with him and kind of understand, like, this guy's really going through it, and he needs a friend. He doesn't need a critic. He doesn't need, maybe not even a wife, not even a woman, just a friend, a person to really help him,
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think we have probably.
I know this might have to be a 2-part thing. What are we on now? I mean,
I think we're only a little over an hour. Over an hour.
So I could probably just give you the ending, because
yes, we need to let them know, that let our viewers and listeners know the ending. Yes.
Right. We don't want to leave too much of a cliffhanger, but essentially Poe met the condition of not drinking, of course, and she was able to convince her mother to consent to the union, but she had to forfeit her inheritance, which she did. She forfeited that inheritance. She signed over, it was like $5,000 in cash and 60 different savings bonds and stocks, which in today's money, it equates to well over $184,000. So it was a hefty, it was a hefty sum of money she was signing over, but her mother didn't want Poe getting his hands on her money after they were married, because I think that's what she mainly thought his motive was just to kind of get at her family wealth. And so they planned to wed on Christmas Day, 1848, but just 2 days before then, an anonymous note was passed to Sarah Helen Whitman while she was at the Athenaeum, and the note informed her that Poe was seen drinking at his hotel, that he had called for a glass of wine. He was seen intoxicated. He broke his vow. The wedding was off, and I don't think it was so much so that she believed the note, because we don't actually know if it was true or not. Poe claims he hadn't had anything to drink, and he tried to explain this to her, and I don't think it was that she believed that he had a drink. I think it was the scrutiny that she just kept facing from her friends and family, that she said, this wedding cannot be, and it will never be. We can never be, because it's just, and Poe even said to Whitman in a letter kind of earlier on in their romance, but it kind of was foreshadowing that, he told her that, Helen, I see that my friend, or your friends are not my own. And so he kind of knew that she was surrounded by people that didn't approve of him. So she broke off the union. He left Providence. In fact, her mother kicked him out of the house as he pleaded with her to, reconsider. and he went back to New York, and they never saw each other again. He wrote to her a month later, in a very cold letter. He kind of addressed her very coldly as Madam and Mrs. W, very like formal kind of, but yeah, that was it. And so she didn't reply. She figured, let's not stir him up again. Let's just let the dust settle. But of course he died 10 months after that, and she never got that closure. But again, she would spend the next 30 years vindicating him and publishing multiple things, articles, and even a book in 1860 titled Edgar Poe and His Critics, to kind of bring the truth to light about him, his character, and his true genius. And so she did just that. And to her dying day, she was corresponding with Poe's biographers, having her caretakers transcribe letters for her. She was tenacious. She was really tenacious. She helped Mallarmé translate The Raven into French because she was bilingual, multilingual. She spoke French, German, Latin, of course, English. And so she helped Mallarmé translate The Raven into French, bringing Poe's works abroad, because in Europe, I mean, he was becoming more popular in Europe than he was in America. Europe kind of appreciated all of him and all of his genius first after his death, and then America kind of got the hint and was like, oh yeah, he's ours. He's our native son. Right. Let's, and so then America took on, but Whitman aided in bringing Poe's works abroad. And so, so not only do we owe her for her work here within the States, but across the ocean. It's amazing. I could go on and on about her, obviously. But it's just, her work was just unmatched when it came to Poe. So we owe her a lot. And
absolutely. And she's such a neat lady. Like, I knew a little bit about her when I did the tour with you. And at the end, I was like, Levi, I've learned so much. And it's like, it's exciting that, there's so much out there that you can read and read and read and still not know everything. And so,
oh yeah, I know. And I've learned that firsthand. It's especially with Whitman, the general biographies of Poe don't even scratch the surface when it comes to Whitman. And even what I've talked about on this podcast in this hour doesn't even, I have so much more I could talk about with Whitman and the things that she did and practiced. And, it goes on and on. But I like to say that a lot of people on my tour, they come for Poe, of course, but then they leave with Whitman. They leave with this new figure in their head, like, oh wow, this woman was incredible, and I had no idea, and so that's kind of been one of my greatest, albeit inadvertent, achievements, is kind of highlighting her through all of this too, so I can kind of spread Poe's legacy and the truth about Poe and just his life and his works, but also highlight Sarah Helen Whitman and kind of bring her to people's bookshelves. I hope it encourages people to kind of pursue her works and her life and her writings, and, so.
Yeah, I totally agree. Well, we're so happy that you guys did this collaboration with us. This has been awesome.
Was a lot of fun. Hopefully I didn't, ramble on for too long, but this is a topic near and dear to my heart, obviously. So I'm glad we could kind of collab on this. And
yes, you are the expert. I kind of read up on just, Sarah Helen Whitman, Rhode Island, and things like that. But, we knew going into this, you would be able to share so much with everybody, and we appreciate that so much.
Well, thank you so much. I appreciate the outlet to do so.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and also just to point out that Rhode Island is no longer known as the sewer, but the ocean state.
The ocean, that's right. That is on our license plate. I might petition to have it changed back to sewer, though. That's more fun.
It does have a lot of people living there. There's 3 times the amount of people living in Rhode Island than in Wyoming. So
we're very condensedly populated for a little tiny state.
Well, and I think, Levi, when I was there for the tour, I think I told you that at one point I was pretty young, maybe 6 or 7. I may have the date wrong, But my dad was almost transferred to Rhode Island with his job. And I think about it now and I'm like, man, what would my life be like if we had moved to most likely Providence, because he traveled up there periodically for his job. So it's just so I've always thought of it, it's just a neat little connection just with my dad that I could have lived there, grew up there.
Crazy. And you would have beat me to the punch.
Maybe
with the tour, you would have stole my whole spotlight because you would have been the Poe Whitman person in Providence, and what would I have been? I would have been like, dang it.
Oh my gosh.
So maybe everything happens for a reason.
It does. It absolutely does.
But that is cool. That is cool.
Yeah. So with me staying here, we've got, there's not really a Poe connection in Tennessee except for Andrew Jackson with King Pest. But, Jeanie and I guess, can be the connection to help, keep showing the connections everywhere.
Yeah, exactly. That in itself is the connection, you're the outlet.
Absolutely.
So that's amazing.
Yeah. So anyway, well, we thank you guys so much. And one thing we want to also remind everybody is the poetry reading event is March 30th from 10 to 4 Central Standard Time. And then the poetry contest opens up for submissions on April 1st. And you're not an April Fool if you submit your poem that day. And that link will be live on our website, 6degreesofpoe.com, and click on the tab, the Poet Like Poe Poetry Contest. That's a hard thing to say fast. And Virginia and Levi will be doing readings on the reading event. So
we are.
I can't wait. Yeah.
Yes. And judges.
Yes.
So,
and judges for the poetry contest again.
Yes. So we're excited for all of that. So I guess at this point, if everybody will join in, we are
Poe
out.
We're getting better.
Forever near thee, soul in soul, near thee forever, yet how far? May our lives reach love's perfect goal in the high order of thy star.